I think the Fed's record on these things is wonderful. It's almost guaranteed to be wrong. They have never called a recession, and particularly not the ones following the great bubbles. This is a huge divergence of a kind that has never happened other than the super bubbles of 1929 and 2000.
Jeremy Grantham, the harbinger of economic storms, emerges from the shadows with a dire proclamation, a tempest brewing on the horizon that threatens to dwarf a mere recession.
We have a little handful of these super bubbles. Every one of them is followed by a recession, right? That's pretty simple. If you get anything really wrong, like 1929, it's followed by depression. If you mess around with the financial system, you have the terrible happenings of the great financial crash. No, I don't think so. I noticed reviewing it last night that there was one little element of contradiction. At one stage I said, you can't call these events to within a few months. And at another point I said, history says that when you reach this level of craziness, the market tends to break within a few months rather than a few years. I think we are descending from the 2021 bubble, which was one of the great bubbles. And this should be normally the deflationary period, the deflating period, which is a function of will the earnings decline, will profit margins decline, will the economy go into recession, and we will have a recession running perhaps deep into next year, and an accompanying decline in stock prices. If you do everything more or less right, if the housing market is just fine, actually cheap in 2000, the bond market is very cheap in 2000, you're really trying to make life simple, you still have a mild recession. And this has been exactly how the great bubbles have broken. The blue chips, the S&P 500, have kept strong right up to the last second, and wave after wave of the stocks that had made the real running peel off and drop. Yeah, I think the Fed's record on these things is wonderful. It's almost guaranteed to be wrong. They have never called a recession, and particularly not the ones following the great bubbles. They prided themselves in stimulating the bubbles. They took credit for the beneficial effect of higher asset prices on the economy. They have never claimed credit for the deflationary effect of asset prices breaking, and they always do.
With a measured tone, he delivers the unsettling truth, cautioning us about the impending cataclysm that looms like a spectral specter over our fragile financial landscape.
Yeah, about 30 years ago, we thought it was a good idea to define what a bubble was, since everyone was talking about it. And we picked a measure of statistical kind of outliership that would be once every 44 years in a random world. And statistically, that's 2 sigma. And that was what we would call a regular bubble. And you would expect trouble. When they hit 3 sigma, which is the kind that should occur every 100 years, we call them super bubbles. And there have only been a very small number of those, 3 of them in the US equity market. This one, the 2000 tech bubble in 1929. There's been one in the US housing market too in 07. So the big picture is you always get a recession, you always get a terrible wipeout of the specs, and you get a pretty hefty decline in the S&P. And if you do anything gratuitously worse than that, like having a bubble in more than one asset class, or messing up your economic policies or your financial policies, you will do worse and things will be bad, which we'll get to. Japan, of course, committed the heinous crime of having the greatest bubble in real estate simultaneously to the greatest bubble ever, 65 times earnings in the stock market. But the 65 times earnings was not nearly as bad as the bubble they had in real estate, where the land under the Emperor's Palace actually really was worth more than the state of California, and more than 10 times the square foot rent downtown Tokyo to New York. to Manhattan. Just incredible. The biggest bubble, I suspect, in history, including the South Sea bubble and tulips.
Within this prophetic caution unfolds a tapestry of economic vigilance, inviting everyone to fortify their financial foundations and ready themselves for the turbulent times that lie ahead.
In 1929, the flakes were down for the year before the market broke. They were down 30%. The year before, they'd been up 85%. They had crushed the market. The really classic example of this is the Russell 2000, which is stock number 1001 to 3000. They're multi-billion-dollar companies. They're a serious enterprise. In the last year, they are down. They have not made any money at all. The S&P's made 23%. The Russell 2000 is meant to go up about 1.2 times the market. In a bull market like you're saying there was, it should have been up about 30%. It wasn't even up recently. This is a huge divergence of a kind that has never happened other than the super bubbles of 1929 and 2000. 2000, you may remember, the growth stocks peeled off and were down 50%. The S&P was flat, which meant the remaining 70% had risen 20%. This is an enormous divergence, and it happens on the upside for the blue chips. So this is it's almost eerily classic.
It's a pattern.
It's a pattern. It's a very rare pattern. And we have been checking off this list all year. When I sat down a year ago, we had seen the accelerating phase that you need in a bubble. That had taken place last year with the NASDAQ up over 100 from the low, but also up 58% from December of 2019. So even granted that decline, it was a hell of a year. It was a year of acceleration. And the NASDAQ has started to weaken relative to the blue chips. The Russell has started to weaken much, much more so even than NASDAQ. I always like to say there's nothing more supremely irritating than watching your neighbors get rich. It is just irresistible to try and join in. And when enough people hit the inflection point, it sucks in everybody. And they're the great bubbles. They're the ones that are interesting. Mostly there's a nice balance between bulls and bears. And once in a blue moon, every 20 years or so, you'll hit an inflection point where enough people become bullish that people stop thinking about fundamentals.
The spotlight narrows on Jeremy Grantham, a sentinel of economic foresight, beckoning us to heed his warning and fortify our positions against the impending financial deluge.
I think the idea here to get your brain around is that there's a huge commercial imperative for the big firms, the banks, the brokerage houses, the Goldman Sachs's, to play right up to the end. It's hugely profitable. They're never, as a firm, convincingly bearish, ever. And they never will be. It doesn't make commercial sense. But at the top, even though they feel the commercial imperative to be bullish, they're thinking to themselves, but my God, the market looks expensive. So I'm darned if I'm going to dance over the edge in Puma Tech in 2000. I'm going to dance over the edge in Coca-Cola in 1929 or Coca-Cola in 2000. And it works. When the end comes, it is always better to have danced off the cliff with the great blue chips than with the specs. And the defining feature of the great bubbles, the super bubbles, is that towards the end, even on the upside, as the S&P and the blue chips go up, the super specs that have led the market for the previous few years start to go down. They don't even underperform. They get the sign wrong. Today, as we sit, well over 40% of every stock on the NASDAQ is down over 50% from its high. So this divergence, which is very rare, occurred in 1929, occurred in 1972 in front of a good bear market, occurred in 2000, and is once again has started since about the spring of last year. Grantham Foundation, our performance is absolutely vital to us because it governs how much we can pay out as grants as well as everything else. And with 75% in VC, you better believe our 25% It's credit default swaps and short Russell, short NASDAQ, and so on. But what if you have a more normal portfolio? The one component for the long term that is very interesting that I missed, which GMO has a very good fund, and that's a resource fund. We have a very good 5-year record in that one too. And both of them and the climate are slightly ahead of the S&P, which has been the guy to beat over 5 years. And our resource fund just attempts to look out at the problems, anticipate them, and get ahead. But resources have some very interesting features. First of all, they at 10-year horizons, I know that's a long horizon, but they are negatively correlated with the balance of your portfolio. When resources are going up, there's pressure on the rest of your portfolio, and vice versa. Now, no other group diversifies like resources, not even close. Even, you pick utilities, the correlation never gets kind of below 75%. But this one, after 5 years, it's down to 25. And at 10 years, it's actually very tiny negative correlation. Brilliant. And when inflation occurs, not always, but almost always, it benefits for obvious reasons. So it is not only a good diversifier, but it's a particularly good one now when you're suddenly, after 20 years, worried about inflation again.
In this age of economic uncertainty, Jeremy Grantham stands as a harbinger, urging us all to fortify our financial abodes, for the storm approaching may dwarf any tempest we have weathered before.
I started writing quarterly letters in 98, and 98, 99, of course, was a glorious bubble. And it just went up and up and up and up. And we fought the bubble all the way. So we were horrifically too early. That was a brutal 2 years, and the earnings were rising as well. So the market made a magnificent move from its all-time high in early 98, went straight up until March of 2000. And our clients did not approve of us being early, and to a very considerable degree fired us. A standard bubble we defined over 20 years, perhaps 25 years ago, as a 2 sigma statistical event. It's just a measure of how much of an outlier you are. So you have a historical
deviation from trend.
Yeah, you have a price series of the S&P. You can